Shabbat Shalom. There was big news in book sales this past week, and I'm not talking about the price of Amazon stock. This past week, the world's oldest, nearly complete Hebrew Bible was sold at Sotheby's for a cool $38 million. Taking just 6 minutes until the gavel announced the sale, it's one of the highest prices ever paid for a book. The volume includes all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, minus a few pages that went missing at some point over the last 1,000 years. The buyer, Alfred Moses, is donating the book to the new Anu Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. So after decades of being held in private collection, it will finally and appropriately go on public display. So what's so special about this particular book? Known as Codex Sasson, it's 792 pages, made of 400 parchment leaves, and written by a single scribe, is a masterpiece of scribal arts. Its writing and layout recall a Torah scroll, but it is a codex, that is, it is a book form. It's dated somewhere between 880 and 960 of the Common Era. Now, true, the Dead Sea Scrolls are much, much older, 1,000 years older, but they don't include the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. What's more, this book contains the Masoretic notes. Let me remind you who the Masoretes were. You know that the Torah is very difficult to read because it's written without vowels and without punctuation. So how do we know how to read the Torah? We know thanks to the Masoretes, who lived in Tiberia, in Tiberias, and they came along and standardized how words were spelled, vocalized, accented, and chanted. They did so by adding vowels and punctuation in the form of trope, the musical notation. In this way, the Masoretic text became the authoritative version of the Bible. And this particular book is the earliest, most complete copy of the Hebrew Bible with the Masoretic notes. If you're interested in learning more about the Masoretes, you can turn to the very first pages of the introduction of our Humashim. This is, in my mind, cool stuff. And when you see a picture of this Bible, it really takes your breath away. My question is, do you think that Sotheby's intentionally timed the sale to happen right before Shavuot, when we celebrate God's giving of the Torah on Sinai? To prepare for the holiday and to appreciate the significance of this very rare book, I want to show you an example of what the Masoretes did and why it matters. And this, for a moment, is going to get very detailed. But we will see that all of those minute dots make a very large point. And we have the perfect example at the very beginning of Parshat Bamidbar, the parsha that we read right before Shavuot. So let me ask you to open up your Humashim to page 771 for just a moment. Page 771. So on page 771, look with me at verse 16. It says, "Those are the elected of the assembly." Those are the elected of the assembly. Now, just before this verse, the Torah lists the heads of the 12 tribes. And these were people of renown. And so it might make sense, this translation that says that they were elected to their leadership positions. But look closely at the Hebrew. Even if you don't read Hebrew, you can see what I'm about to say. Look closely at the Hebrew verse, and you'll see that there is a word that's written without vowels, without those dots underneath it. So that is the way that the word appears in a Torah scroll. It's ketiv, how it is written. And it says kri'i, they are elected. But right next to it is the way the Masoretes told us to pronounce that word, to pronounce it karui, which means they were called. The 12 people were called to serve as leaders. Now, the Masoretes, they were not just kind of willy-nilly taking liberties with God's words and stretching a yud into a longer vav. Remember, Masorete comes from the word masoret, which means tradition. They were actually preserving the tradition of how to read the Torah. And indeed, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Torah, 1,000 years earlier, before the Masoretes, they read it as karui, as chosen. Well, I'll let you ponder the difference between kri'i and karui, between being elected and being called. You might, for example, think about the difference between those who seek to win a political election and those who step forward to answer the call to duty. For now, though, and you can close your Humashim, I want to build on what I just shared with Noah and linger over this notion of being called. The previous book of the Torah, Vayikra, Leviticus, in it God called to Moshe. And here at the beginning of the fourth book of the Torah, the book of Numbers, we see that the congregation is calling for 12 leaders to serve. But as we approach Shavuot, there's an even larger calling going forth. Now, the word Bible comes from the Greek word biblion, which is actually a translation by Greek-speaking Jews of the Hebrew word hasfarim, the books. And indeed, the Hebrew Bible is a collection of 24 books. But there is a different word that better captures what the Bible is, not its structure, but its purpose. That is the word mikra. Mikra is from that same word, calling. The Bible is, to use Buber and Rosenzweig's term, a calling out. It calls out to each of us. If we but listen carefully enough, quietly enough, knowledgeably enough, we too might hear its call. Let's sit with that notion for just a moment. Scripture, the Bible, is a calling forth. Unfortunately, we don't always treat it that way. Oftentimes people will say to me, "Oh yeah, that story of wandering the desert for 40 years, I know that story. I've read that one before." But it's not enough to know the story. The word mikra challenges us to encounter the Torah not by reading and knowing, but by listening. Louis Finkelstein, the former chancellor of the seminary, once is allegedly said, "When I pray, I speak to God, and when I study, God speaks to me." But I'm not sure that that's how we often encounter the Torah. We practice our Torah readings, or we read Torah and we study commentaries. But do we really listen to Torah? When we read, are we listening for God to call out to us? We could use more listening in our world. There are voices calling out, "Hear me, notice me, help me." And we say to ourselves, "Oh yeah, I know that story. I've heard that one before." In marriage, do we really listen to our spouses? As parents, do we truly listen to our children? As friends, as coworkers, do we listen? We can't claim to hear the voice of God if we fail to listen to the voices of our fellow humans. Now, don't think that these are two separate realms, listening to people and listening for God. They're one and the same, as Michael Fishman writes in his book, Sacred Attunement. He writes, "When persons are regarded as embodiments of the effusing vitalities of divinity," in other words, when people are considered, are experienced as being created in God's image, we must seek to nurture their sacred presence by attuning ourselves to their very being. Torah, we're told at the beginning of our parsha, was given in the Sinai desert. Why there? In the Midbar, in the desert, the Israelites could hear God midaber, speaking, calling out. The same is true for us. We live in a noisy world. There are 1,000 people and devices clamoring for our attention. From time to time, then, we need to step back from the noise and the hubbub of the social world and create in our hearts the stillness of the desert. Doing so, we make space for others and for the other to be heard. And Shavuot is the perfect time, for it is a Mikra Kodesh, a time when we are called to gather, to listen, to learn, and to respond as we say, Na'aseh v'nishma. To hear the voice of God, we need a listening silence in the soul. There within the silence, may we hear the kol dmama daka, the still small voice of God calling forth with words that are truly priceless. Shabbat shalom.